When the Overwatch League rosters were being announced prior to the preseason starting, a lot of spectators, analysts, fans of Overwatch esports looked down on the Boston roster as it wasn't a star-studded, all-star cast of playmakers necessarily, but I think after watching them play in the preseason, we can confidently say that this team is incredibly capable, and was far underrated from the start, probably unfairly, especially with showings from a few other teams that we might have assumed would have been ranked higher, like Florida Mayhem and the Shanghai Dragons. Even if we were to call Boston Tier 3, I think they're at the top of Tier 3, and potentially with enough work can put in to improve to potentially make a playoff run late into the season. They're a team that if you're a fan of, I think you'll be proud to watch them grow and develop, and the great thing about watching them in the preseason is that they showed off a lot of different compositions, a lot of strategies that they're willing to try, and they looked very capable on a vast array of different heroes, led I think by a very stable tank core and some playmakers on DPS that shouldn't go unnoticed. You may not know these names yet, but I think as we get into the season, you'll start to. Today, we're going to break down a few clips from the Boston Uprising and try to give some shine and hype around this team, who many were looking down on as a cast of nobodies, but they've clearly put the work in as a team to be competitors, and I don't think they're a group you should be counting out anytime soon, especially with the height of skill that they've shown, as well as the diversity of strategy that they're clearly practicing behind the scenes and putting the work into to display for us come game day. Let's take a look at some examples of what that is here with a few different clips. We're going to be starting it off on Numbani, and we'll be able to see how the Boston Uprising successfully hold against the attack strategies that the Dragons send at them. So, what are the Dragons up to? First and foremost, they go for a strategy that I've seen a lot of teams utilize, where I'm going to call a main upper split, where they send the tanks up the main street in order to provoke a response from the defense to defend against those tanks, and then they'll sneak a ranged character onto the high ground, largely uncontested, to shoot down. The win condition of Numbani, of course, is to hold the high ground long enough to be able to frag out and control the map. Trading out on this point is really, really bad, as we're going to see right now, where the Shanghai Dragons commit too hard, chasing down kills and end up losing their lives, making it an inevitability that the Dragons are going to have to back off. Even though they start the beginning of the fight correct with a frag, holding the high ground, they get caught out. They don't sustain and finish the fight. That's a very important term that I think I'm trying to really bring up and emphasize over and over again, because this happens so much in matchmaking, in pro play, everywhere. It's a very Overwatch type issue where if a team doesn't properly finish the second stage of the fight, it doesn't matter. I mean, you can imagine, we can put this into like a micro example. If a Widowmaker does everything right, lines up the headshot, but doesn't pull the trigger in time, you don't get that kill, right? You don't finish the kill. In the same way, if you don't finish the push, you're going to get stalled out. Those characters on the ground have to sustain long enough to allow your ranged characters to do the critical damage and clean up the point. If you overcommit and trade, you're probably going to lose. So the Dragons back up, begin the regroup, and are set to go at it again. As you can see, once again, the main upper split is set up, but Undead is sneaking around the backside looking for either cleanup or provoking a response. And it's a little bit difficult to see everything, but I'll put it in slow motion so we can try. Boston Uprising peel back from the aggression of the dive tanks, and off-screen, Striker counter-engages into the critical point of the map up to the high ground and sticks a pulse bomb to take out both healers in the backline, thus obviously ending the push. There's no way that the Dragons are going to sustain out of this, so they just run the heck out of there. That type of play is picture-perfect counter-engage. You allow the play to develop, and you find the weakness typically at the most hotly contested point of contact, the area of the map that you can't allow the enemy to hold, and put your resources there. Boston putting the pulse bomb up on the high ground, really, if he killed anything, even if it was just the soldier, one support, both, whatever, it was going to be a high-value play and decision. So, in preparation for this dive to come in, Snow on the Ana plays miles back down the street, looking to catch this engagement and make sure that he doesn't get caught out. Although I would say this is a good call, it also gives up a whole lot of the map. And the Winston bubble from Roshan on the high ground blocks off all of Ana's capabilities from this range position anyway. Big split, cleaving the defense apart. They find the right engagement. However, they popped their Valkyrie probably earlier than they needed. They obviously wanted to punch through on that point, but using it so early allowed for Boston to wait it out and then pop their own on a retake, which just comes in guns a-blazing and retakes on a point where usually a retake isn't even possible. This all happened really quickly, so we're going to take another look at it and try to pick apart where the play is made, because really securing this retake at this critical moment means that Boston is going to be in a huge advantage going into their attacking side. So here a few things happen. Snow is getting knocked around by Roshan on the backside. Dia pops his tack visor, but there really isn't anyone there to kill. Striker wins the duel against Undead, who does get rezzed, but Striker gets the heck out of there and waits for his teammates to come back. A full 6v6 breaks out, and the Dragons have a Pulse Bomb and Transcendence up against Primal Rage and Valkyrie. Gamsu leaps into the corner of the point, places a bubble to allow his team to avoid damage as they come to challenge. They try to focus on the monkey, but he's able to pop Primal Rage in time, soaks up a ton of damage, and then gets away to fly off into the air, never to be seen again. The legend of Gamsu lives on to go get the Mega Health Pack on the outside. This is so good. The Dragons did an amazing job nearly killing Gamsu, but they just didn't find the damage fast enough, and him getting away allowed for all the time in the world for the Uprising to permeate the point and make it a very messy fight, which the attacking team holding for the retake doesn't want. They want the enemy off the point, dying as quickly as possible. Getting this into a messy fight where you have Valk up in the air makes this nearly impossible. Striker finds the Pulse Bomb on Dia, and with the damage amp from Avast, they start to melt down the tanks. Gamsu comes back in healthy, and they just clean everything up instantly with a big crossfire. Picture perfect retake play, and what went wrong here? Well, of course, Dia on the soldier can't die. He's the number one target, so staying away from the Tracer is what you want to do, and I would have much preferred to see him on the high ground rather than brawling it out on the low ground. Gamsu, of course, is kind of the low-key hero of this play, somehow getting away with a nick of health to come back in, buying a ton of time and really making all the space for the Valkyrie to do its job. That's the thing in this meta right now, guys. If the enemy team has a Valkyrie and you don't have a good response to either kill the Valk or kill way more on the ground than they can, you're just going to lose. The Dragons did not look prepared for this incoming Valkyrie retake, and then of course it sends their final push into desperation mode where they just sort of funnel onto the point, don't unlock the payload, and that's going to spell doom for this map, as Boston are going to have a fairly easy time capturing it themselves. There's some interesting team compositions that I want to look into at Lijiang, but before we get there, I want to highlight a few star plays that happened on the map prior to this, Junkertown, where the DPS showed off what they're capable of. I haven't heard enough clamor for this Tracer hero play that Striker pulled off on the streets phase of Junkertown. I think it quite possibly is the most impact a single Tracer player has had in a team fight ever. I'm not kidding, because look at what he was up against here. Both Undead and Striker pulse bomb and burst down the front lines respectively of each other's team. But all the while, Shanghai Dragons was using Valkyrie, making the context of this play mean so much more. This is what I mean when I say you have to frag way harder on the ground to outplay it. Striker then wins the duel against Undead. Five King goes battle Mercy mode, taking out his Mercy counterpart, but Striker's there with the punish, and although Dia snipes out Dream Casper, guess who's still on the payload brawling it out? How many kills does this man have to get? And you might be thinking sometimes when you're playing the game from, let's say, like Undead's perspective, asking yourself, what more do I have to do? Undead killed 3 of his own and his team can barely scrape out the fight. Well, that's because Striker went even bigger, now killing the Zenyatta, harassing Dia on the Widowmaker. This fight has been going on so long, Undead, who Striker fragged earlier in the fight, comes back and Striker gets another pulse bomb. This is why we need VODs, guys, because the camera 100% was on the wrong player on this play. Sure, they end up giving up a few meters of payload distance, but the whole next regroup has already happened and the team fight has reset. Extending a team fight for that long, investing your Valkyrie into a fight is such an economy win that I think it's that moment almost specifically that won the map for Boston. Also, of course, Boston came out with a Bastion on the cart strat that China couldn't stop, but regardless, China's not going to be able to finish the map here, and largely because getting stalled out on streets is something that's not supposed to happen. Finishing the map on Junkertown should be really easy, but when you make heroic tracer plays like that, it becomes next to impossible. Then another stall-tastic, hectic fight comes out. Green Casper builds up the Dragon Blade. He starts slicing and dicing, and he frags everybody again. And this is something that I think you'll start to appreciate from this dynamic duo. They can play a lot of heroes and play them better than I think a lot of viewers were giving them credit for. They definitely look to struggle at times against the all-star power of Pine from NYXL, but I, for one, am excited to see these players develop over time, and if they can raise their level to be able to handle some of the best of the best. Now, the last map we're going to look at is the Decider map on Lijiang between the Dragons and the Uprising. Lijiang goes the distance, and it really shows everything in the bag of tricks that Boston is bringing to the table, and their willingness to try things that are a bit wonky, a bit defiant against the meta, even when it kind of fails pretty badly. And we saw this especially against NYXL, where they sometimes would try a strategy over and over again, and it would very clearly be getting countered, but they like grind through it. Well, they come out of the doors here with this intense control comp, but I think the missing piece here really is a Lucio. We've seen teams like Seoul try this comp before. We've covered it on the channel, where you have the Zarya, Rein, Phalanx. You can play around the cooldowns of like a Doomfist. You can play around the control of the Flashbang and Mines of McCree and Junkrat. But the issue is this comp is doomed to fail, I think, because there isn't a sustainable way to deal with Tracer, who's one of the most powerful DPS heroes in all of Overwatch. That's the reason why you oftentimes see a Tracer, even just to duel the enemy Tracer, because there often isn't a way to really stop her from having impact unless one of your crowd control abilities is able to land. Ana, McCree, Junkrat, one of them has to step up to the plate and hit a skill shot, quote-unquote skill shot. Obviously, hitting a mine maybe isn't a skill shot, but on a Tracer it definitely is. You have to hit an ability on the Tracer, or she's just going to wreck your backline and you lose the whole point for free. And they stick on this composition for way too long. The reason why I think Lucio is a must-pick in this context is because Lucio gives mobility to characters that otherwise don't have it. And if you don't have Lucio, well, Tracer just dances around any of these characters that can't really move much, getting free damage all the way, and if you don't land your skill shots, well, she's just going to dominate the game. At the pro level of play, Lucio has been historically, and I think still is, a soft Tracer counter. It allows your team to get where they need. You can even speed the Reinhardt swinging after her. Peels for your Ana or your squishy DPS who don't really want to get dove on necessarily. It helps you get out of these choke points where they're getting jammed up. Dragons can play really greedy towards the choke and they just can't get out. There's no adjustment or flexibility without the Lucio, unfortunately, unless their assumption is Neko on the Ana is just so darn good that he can hit his abilities in order to carry out of the situation. And unfortunately, I think that was proven to not be the case, but that's no knock against him. Even Jaehong can't really utilize Ana from this team comp, I think. So a lesson learned. They move on to the next point, and it's the progression of the different team comps, especially on this map, that I think really shows off the work that the Uprising put in behind the scenes to learn all these different heroes and compositions. Now they go for more of a old school pharmacy dive comp. This is like a classic King of the Hill, aka control point team composition, but Shanghai Dragons goes for the double hit scan. Oftentimes Tracer isn't considered a hit scan, but she should be because she helps harass down the pharmacy as well. And really, for Boston's comp to work, they need to have Gamsu dive the soldier and a rocket to hit as well. But because that doesn't happen and they really struggle to find their footing, Dragons controls the outside with their soldier uncontested. Boston then swap over to classic dive comp off the Mercy, and now Lucio Zen. Retaking into this is a bit of a nightmare, but I think this kind of dive is the best way to do it because it's going to allow you to be able to pick a target, overwhelm them, and get somewhere quickly. Whereas oftentimes on this map specifically, I think you all know this, getting across that bridge can be a nightmare. Just getting into the engagement can be a nightmare. But they do overwhelm Dragons, but they respond with a support and DPS ultimate, which fend off the oncoming attack. But that's okay, Boston is building up ults of their own anyway. However, they did invest the sound barrier into that fight, so they decide that it's time to go back to good old meta with Mercy, which I think works fine because most of their heroes have mobility anyway, and Zen has extreme range, who he can stay out of the fight. So they open up with the Dragon Blade, it cleans up, and although Altering does pop his Valkyrie, Boston Uprising have the fragging on the ground to outweigh those reses. That's really key. They want to fight without using Valk against a Valk, which is very difficult to do, and it kind of requires some star power out of your DPSs to get a lot of value from either their ultimates or their basic mechanics. Now, China is on the retake. The dive comes in from them, but their tanks get bursted down almost immediately. They do pop the trance, and Soldier Sights together again to keep it alive and doing damage, but the trades come back and forth. It isn't really a clean fight, and even though the Dragons start to win it, they are doing so in a really slow fashion, building up a bunch of percentage for Boston Uprising. Going back into it in desperation mode now, Calyx goes to the Lucio once again in order to get to the point quickly. They really got to get their Zen there in order to get value out of the Transcendence. And this fight's absolutely crazy. Gamsu's the sacrificial lamb here. Unfortunately, Neko doesn't get his Transcendence off in time in order to save him. He gets bursted down. Dream Casper finds the mark on Dia. Kalios finds the Mercy. And to the window, to the wall, Dream Casper makes them all fall. Finding the mark, getting the burst damage it takes to reclaim this point. And that's massive. I mean, that's a fight they shouldn't have won, that they clutched out largely mechanically. And here on this oncoming retake, Striker's gonna find the Mercy with a Pulse Bomb. Dream Casper builds up another Dragon Blade, and that's just going to be the dagger. You don't have a support ult to deal with it, and their DPS output is just too much. Dia definitely has the better Widowmaker between the two teams, but it seems quite evident that Dream Casper's Genji was too much to compare to Dia's Soldier. Not that Dia's Soldier's bad, it's just a little too slow, and they weren't really able to catch out any of these flankers to stop them from doing what they wanted. Kind of just classic dive comp principles, really. Now, Boston Uprising, with the game on the line, of course, it's on the preseason, so it's not too big of a deal, but they go into a triple tank Moira composition, which I think makes a lot of sense. Control Center is a map where characters like Junkrat have been used quite often because the battles are quite laney, a lot of splash damage to be had. Well, if splash damage is big, splash healing is just going to be as big, and the charge rate of Nico's Coalescence here in this round is outrageous. But the problem that the comp finds, I think, is two issues. One, for this comp to work, Zarya really has to get high charge, and between Dia's Tracer and the dive tanks of the Dragons, they just don't really charge her up very much, and they just evade Striker's Reaper the entire time, so the fight just sort of stalls out, and they're left to try to heal and sustain, which the Moira definitely works to do, but it's slowly losing them the fight because they don't find a frag. You got to eventually kill something, otherwise you're going to lose. So Boston then swaps it up. Striker goes for a ranged character in order to try to get some burst as well as challenge this Tracer, and ends up working out. The Reinhardt Zarya Phalanx type team composition gives Striker enough room to land shots with the McCree, and of course if he's playing up against a dive comp, there's not going to be any big barriers in his way, and as long as he can hit his shots on the zippy flankers, well, he's going to find those frags. But the real hero of this team comp working is that their Zarya got charged enough to be scary, meaning that the burst healing of Moira actually mattered, and even just the early threat of the McCree to lane out any backline aggression in order to sustain and get those cooldowns back, that's what the Zarya comp needs. It needs time to build up, sustain, and not lose any members. That's really important. And the Reaper didn't really punish any movement that hard. They just had to dance around the Reaper and go kill something else. Whereas the McCree stabilized in the early fight and also could clean up the late fight with no shields to block his shots. Of course, when the camera comes on him, he chokes really hard on the follow-up shot. Hey, don't act like you haven't done that before. Even the best of you McCree players out there. And then he gets dove by the Diva. But despite being down in this fight, you really can see the power that Moira has to keep this team composition up and running, to burst heal her tanks, really get that Zarya churning, and once Zarya gets a bit of charge and you have the Moira healing to either orb her, coalescence her, the tanks are unkillable. I think it's a way to sort of soft counter Tracer, who traditionally is quite good against tanks, but I think she's just not going to have the burst damage to compete with the splash healing that Nico's Moira is going to have. The Dragons here would have to to somehow find a way to get on Moira, but the problem is the architecture of this map really yields for her to have very safe defensive positioning and allow her team to be out in front brawling forever, getting tons of value. So bypassing all those characters to go get her, it's going to be quite expensive and probably find you with a McCree bullet in your dome, as well as a lot of Zarya charge damage down your throat. So that ends up working out. They catch the aggression of the Dragons and end up winning this map with some pretty crafty play. Honestly, on all of the maps that the Boston Uprising played, we saw a lot of weird compositions, a lot of experimental stuff, and this was no different. I think this Moira comp on Control Center is legit, and it's the type of thing that makes me excited to watch a team that is in, let's say, development, like the Boston Uprising, as they're not going into the Overwatch League with a trophy case full of accomplishments, but instead I would say with an open slate to be able to build off of and hopefully find some fans, as well as impress the esports audience with their creative team compositions and big plays. Let me know what you guys think about the Boston Uprising. Do you still rank them quite low on the 12 teams list? If you enjoyed the video, please leave it a like. It really does help us out, lets us know that you're enjoying the content. If you haven't already, please subscribe because we upload each and every day, so you're going to want to hit the bell icon so that you get notified when our videos go live. Linked in the description is our Twitter, where we tweet out news, updates, and dank memes. That's been it for me. I've been Frito for your Overwatch. I'll see you guys next time.